Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and, most importantly, action on all things to do with sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake, here in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco. Today, we've got a flyover of what to expect from the next few weeks as we come up to and run through the 2-week COP26 process at what is an incredibly important point in time. We are halfway from the signing of the Paris Agreement to the end of the 2020s, and that's the incredibly important decade of action. And indeed, we will be back on the 9th of November live from Scotland with a progress update. This is a really critical time. We've all heard the comment about CO2 levels being higher now than they've been for the last 800,000 years. And the truth is, the last time they were at this level was 50 million years ago. The world was very different then, and it was 13 centigrade hotter then. So there is time for action. We've seen already significant investment flows. And of course, we've constantly had the message from ESGX Live that everything about climate action is not necessarily about an imposed cost. It's also about a green opportunity and, of course, green jobs. And so that, of course, is where we're going to start today. So welcome to Paul and Amir and Fadhel to take us into our green jobs report. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody is staying safe and battening down the hatches after a weekend of Pacific Coast storms and today a nor'easter. It's supposed to be an especially intense winter in the Northeast and potentially tepid, but as we all know, climate change is unpredictable and we can have surprise heat waves and surprise ice storms, some of which, like Texas, took out all 10 power lines, transmission power lines. So this is super important. We're really excited for the COP26 gathering and that US President Joe Biden will be there. Apparently Chinese Premier Xi may not. And we'll see what action we can get done as a group. Now, related to that is our monthly Green Jobs Report. We're going to have a super exciting deep dive to kick it off. So Amir Khalegi, a fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, a soon-to-be PhD at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a analyst at HIP Investor, is going to go through the latest of how hip is our economy. Are we building back better, or do we need to do it for real this time? And then Dr. Fadhel Kaboub of Denison University and head of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and Nigel Lake of Potender will join us, and we'll dive even deeper on green jobs and COP26. All right, Amir, fire it up.
Awesome, thank you.
How are the green jobs going?
So let me get to my PowerPoint slide and I will tell you all. So thank you, Paul, for the introduction. And as always, our Green Jobs Report, it provides data-driven insights on the direction and momentum towards greening the US economy. So for those of you who are just joining us, or for those of you who need a refresher, Paul and his company HIP Impact Plus Profit, HIP Investor, provides HIP ratings that are based on 7 HIP pillars, which are shown here: health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. His company does a in-depth analysis for not only companies, but also municipal bonds. But for this analysis, we look at US companies, over 2,000 of them, with HIP impact ratings, and we cross-map the company data to US industry data that is provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, specifically the Current Employment Statistics Survey. Once these companies are mapped to their respective industries, we are then able to provide a weighted HIP industry rating. And These ratings are on a scale of 0 to 100. Currently, the ceiling is 75. Therefore, extractive industries, the lowest bucket, is rated from 0 to 25. Slightly extractive industries are rated from 25 to 50, and green industries are rated from 50 to 75. So, how hip is the economy? As said in the beginning, the new feature to this month's report is an overall hip rating for the entire economy. And we look to answer, with employment decreasing, are we building back better? What type of jobs are we returning to? And are we building back to a hipper economy than we previously had? The in-depth results will be presented at the end of our normal report, so we'll get back to that, and it'll be exciting. So as we've seen here, jobs in greener industries have been the most resilient to the COVID-19 impact, and have shown the most resiliency and stability across the entire pandemic itself. We can see here that in August, we're still around 4 million below the February 2020 employment levels. And as said in our previous reports, starting in around April of this year, April 2021, a lot of the employment gain has been driven by leisure and hospitality sectors, thus showing this overtaking of green industries by slightly extractive industries back in June. But interestingly, this month, we're seeing that restaurants, especially, and other leisure and hospitality industries are starting to slow in their return to employment. So for those of you who have been joining us for the past few months, you would know that restaurants was leading the industry gainers for the past 3 months by significant portions. But interestingly, this month it was amongst the highest industry losers, industries that lost the most employment. So what does that indicate? Or also another thing that's very interesting as well, we're seeing the regaining of elementary and secondary schools leading the way. And that is due to, this is August employment, new school year is rolling around, ramping up employment for, as schools are transitioning from online to in-person, it's requiring more work. And some of you might ask, why is this impact rating so low, human impact plus profit rating? Well, the human impact plus profit rating, as stated before, encompasses many pillars: wealth, health, earth, equality, trust, products and services. So for the education, elementary and secondary school industry, their products and services rates extremely high, above an 80%. But given the COVID situation and types of pay that these workers are receiving, those pillars are rating relatively low, and especially with the health endangerment and how do I say, the health dangers that come along with close high contact industries, it will cause these seemingly beneficial industries to rate lower in the human impact plus profit rating score. So moving on to the look at over the year of the industry leaders and laggards. So for this specific month, we showcased those top 4 and top 4 leaders and top 4 laggards. And here you can see that indicated by this bubble here, that leisure and hospitality industries are actually they were the most volatile throughout the entire pandemic. So February 2020, when the news of the pandemic started, we saw the largest drop off in March. We can see that leisure and hospitality, for the selected showcased industries that were displayed on the past graph, they are the most volatile, going from the highest absolute change and then over the month, having the highest return of employment. But as we can see, if we're looking at January, starting in January 2021, we can see that leisure and hospitality industries, they're always a little bit above the other aggregated line of the non-leisure and hospitality industries. But as we get to June and August, with the employment gain slowing, we can see that these lines are converging, meaning that I don't want to say like artificial gains, but the return to employment, we've been returning reluctantly back to leisure and hospitality, but we're not returning into higher quality employment, which that will be noted later on in this presentation. Explained further. So as we can see here, moving on to pay, green jobs have been paying more than a level much higher than slightly extractive or extractive industries. I apologize, I forgot to update these bullet points on the side, so ignore those for now. But if we're looking at the overall levels, the change from July to August on green industries is an increase of 5 cents, which actually, it's good that it has raised, but slightly extractive and extractive industries have outpaced the change of green industries. As we can see here, for slightly extractive industries, there is a increase of 12 cents, whereas extractive industries, it's an increase of around 9. But what this means is that for anyone looking, going out on the town or seeing, there's a labor shortage of leisure and hospitality employment. And we've noticed that workers, or not workers, but owners and businesses, especially in the leisure and hospitality sector, or lower quality employment, have had to pay a premium to get workers to come back to work post-pandemic. So what we can see here and what it is showing is that even it's good that pay is increasing, but workers are really reluctant to come back to their old jobs because of the quality that of the jobs, whether it be pay, whether it be work flexibility, whether it be benefits. So what this is showing is that extractive industries are having to pay more for people to come back, but even more so, slightly extractive industries, although being slightly extractive, they are more willing to pay higher premiums, higher wages to those workers in order for them to return as compared to extractive industries.
And Amir, a question from the audience: is this average or is this median?
This is average hourly earnings at this point. Yeah.
Right. All right. And now you're going to look at the past almost 2 years, right? And so it looks like there is wage inflation.
Right. So this is actually around 2 years or so, close to. And we can see here that yes, there is wage inflation, and we will see that actually on the next graph. What I want to show here is the maintenance and movement over the past 2 years or so of the greenest bucket, slightly extractive and extractive industries. But interestingly, although there's a very clear level break, we can even see here that slightly extractive or green industries and slightly extractive industries greatly outpace extractive industry in terms of wage growth. And we're seeing here as a base from January 2010 over the past decade, we can see that it's greatly outperforming. So at a margin of around 10%. So that is very, eye-opening to me. And it just goes to show that greener industries, higher HIP rated industries, are more focused on wage growth, better flexibility, and changing in a more beneficial environment for workers themselves. So Moving on, we did an analysis over high contact and low contact sectors. High contact sectors are occupations that require work to be within arm's length that don't require social distancing. Low contact industry sectors are is occupations that allow for social distancing. You don't have to be in close proximity. And to no surprise, high contact industry sectors were the most susceptible to job loss during the pandemic. We can see here that from the graph, around 2.6 million jobs in high contact industry sectors are still below the February 2020 level, whereas low contact industry sectors, we are still below the February 2020 level by around 1.2 million. Looking here over across the same time span of around 2 years, the blue line here indicates low contact industry sectors, and then the red and green dots indicate above 30 and below 30. And the takeaway here is that even in high contact industry sectors, higher HIP rated industries were more resilient and faster to recover as compared to lower HIP rated industries.
And Amir, this sounds like it's important, you know, A, from an economy point of view, B, from a worker point of view, like where do you want to work? You want to work in a sustainable industry or at least in a sustainable company, preferably with low contact versus, you know, high contact. And 3, it probably matters for your portfolio. Like these, you know, look like more stronger, more resilient companies to be a part of your portfolio. So for the economy, for the worker, and for the investor, this seems pretty obvious.
Right. And I think also too, just because an industry is in a high contact industry, it's been shown that the higher HIP rated industries are quicker to adjust to whatever issue is presented in front of them. So they're highly adaptive to the situation that is going on, rather than being slower to respond to these issues that are ahead that cause, you know, greater problems. You know, they're operating at a more efficient level for both the worker in mind, but are quicker to react. And, you know, yeah, that's my analysis on it as well. So yeah, this being said, you know, we can move on to our newer analysis of how HIP is the US economy. So there's a lot to digest in this graph, so I'll walk through it with you all. The thick blue line is the overall HIP weighted economy rating. The dashed dark line is the unemployment rate, and below it we're looking at the month-over-month percent change in employment for each of the industry buckets. What we are seeing, though, is that as unemployment declines, so is the hipness of the economy. So what this indicates is that as we are returning to our original levels of employment, over these past almost 2 years, which is really weird to say, you know, it still sometimes feels like we're in 2020. It's still like COVID, and you know, it is surreal in this way. But we have had all this time to rethink the way that we go through our normal work conditions, but we're still building back in the same patterns as before. And yeah, that's, I mean, it's what it is being shown by this graph here. And not only this, oh, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up, Amir, and we'll get into this in the discussion too when Fadhel and Nigel join. But it's really fascinating that COVID attacked not only our, you know, biological systems, but the result of which is it produced a beneficial effect, even for a short period of time, in that the more sustainable jobs and the more sustainable industries, which were more resilient, boosted our overall economy. Yet, as we're building back a little bit better, because that blue line is still above the pre-COVID line, we've eaten up more than half the distance back to that pre-existing. And so in the best case, and Fadhel and Nigel have said this many times, it's as well as you and I have, we need to be increasing the average. When you do hiring in your company, or you want to up the average, you want to keep hiring more and more talented people if you can, to up the average across a range of skills. Our US economy is building back the same, or building back a little bit better, but not a lot back better. And so that's, I think, what's really powerful about this. And we did a preliminary analysis of this with Dr. Scott Fulweiler of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and he took it back all the way to the 2008 crisis. And something similar happened in the 2008 crisis. The hipness of the economy went up, and then it regressed as the old jobs returned, essentially, or forms of the old jobs or old industries returned. So, all right, well, we'll spark some discussion, hopefully, in the chat. And why don't you finish up, Amir, and then we'll bring everybody on.
Perfect. Yeah, that perfectly said. And one last thing that I wanted to comment on when you were saying it's we're not back to the pre-COVID hipness of the economy, but we're getting there. Although the unemployment rate is starting to inch closer to pre-COVID levels, what actually also I believe is happening is that workers are hesitant towards going back to their old occupations, whether it be the lower quality ones, especially in regard to the lower quality employment opportunities. But what also that means is the unemployment calculation is also dropping out. There's a higher proportion of workers who have not been seeking jobs in the past, I think that it's 30 weeks or so. So they're getting dropped out of the normal unemployment rate calculation. And not only that, more workers are going to work for themselves because of the flexibility of their work schedule and wanting those types of opportunities for themselves. So something to keep an eye on. It's very interesting. And, we'll be here to report on it month after month, sort of thing. So with that being said, I can turn it over to the next portion of the discussion.
Great. Well, Fadhel and Nigel, please come back. Amir, great job at digging into this, blending it all together to show how the US economy, at least, has more opportunity if it chooses to. Of course, that requires some political considerations. Fadhel and Nigel, you're experts at looking at economies around the world. Do you think this is, happening similarly around the world in the countries you've observed?
Well, thank you, Paul and Nigel, for hosting us again, and thank you, Amir, for an excellent presentation. I think that the data that Amir showed us today is so important for us to understand where we stand in this transition, where we stand in terms of our commitment to building a more resilient economy. It is, without having to repeat everything that Amir said, but the basics is that it's a no-brainer. Greener jobs are more resilient during a crisis. They pay better. They improve the overall hipness of the economy. Unfortunately, that improvement happened when we had to shut down a lot of the extractive industries, the lower rated hip industries. But it should have been a moment for us to take the opportunity to restart the economy during the recovery on a stronger, more solid foundation. And unfortunately, it looks like we're restarting the old engines of the extractive industries as opposed to transitioning to greener, more resilient, more stable jobs. Unfortunately, it looks like the majority of countries around the world are rushing to restart the same extractive engines. But at the same time, we're dealing with things like the IPCC report that told us that this is a climate emergency. It's not a joke anymore, right? If we haven't heard the alarm bells the year before or the year before it, we're really facing massive costs associated with climate change, direct and indirect costs. not just in terms of the countries who are on the front lines of climate change, small island nations and coastal areas, but forest fires and droughts and extreme weather events that are destroying crops and really putting pressure on infrastructure that wasn't built to deal with microbursts of rainstorms and things like that. And this is true in the U.S. and to even a greater extent in countries that don't have the same infrastructure that Europe or Japan or Korea and the US have.
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree, Fadhel. I think this data is really important because it allows us to know there's an awful lot of discussion about green jobs, and this is actual fact. I know from the work we're doing in Australia that at a micro level, there is a lot more activity around private sector investment in renewable energy and exporting that energy to Asia through the link that's proposed from the Northern Territory up to Singapore. We've seen significant investment in green hydrogen projects announced by Fortescue and Fortescue Future Industries. But, and despite all of that, there is also a sense of people are going back to work and going back to their lives as before. And the Australian government has just announced that it will commit to a 2050 net zero target. But it's also included that announcement, an explicit statement that it won't change anything compared to what it's doing already. And what it's doing already is quite limited. And indeed, the delivery of net zero in Australia will be done by the states, almost all of whom have committed to net zero anyway. So the bit that the federal government's responsible for is quite limited in all of that. So that makes for a messy story. And the other country I was going to pick out was the UK, where, again, perhaps nothing to do with action on climate change per se, because the government there is reasonably progressive on this, but because of the impact of Brexit shutting down ability to work flexibly for anybody in professional services, for example, who might otherwise travel around Europe to work. And I don't just mean people in jobs, I'm thinking of people in sports and people in music. For many of those industries, those creative, collaborative type professions, which is where I suspect many of the greener jobs are, have been, you would expect to see, if this data was available on the UK, they've been hit pretty hard too. So
yeah, so I think we've been poking around on this too, on like what jobs data is available in different regions and countries. So if you and the audience have detailed jobs data on a particular country, we're happy to map the workforce and the industry to these, and because I think what you'll find is something similar. The pay is higher, the job duration is more resilient, and the value add to nature and society is higher than an extractive job that just sets up future externalities. So it's been said, about low quality retail jobs, like sometimes at Walmart or McDonald's historically. You pay the people so low that they go on government benefits that then, of course, creates a strain on local governments, regional governments, national governments. And if people are paid a fair wage today, like Best Buy advocating for $15 an hour, Bank of America, $20 an hour, there's no erosion of demand. There may be a slight adjustment to profit margins in the near term, but when people are paid appropriately, they're more productive. And so the return on investment of human capital can be positive, even though to many financially minded people, they think of like, oh, I pay people more money, I make less money for shareholders. No, you invest more in your people, they become more productive, more resilient, more happy, and then they end up innovating for you. And this is, proven in several different academic analyses. All right, Nigel, you have an agenda.
I think that Iceland's just done an experiment on cutting the working week significantly, I think. And from what I've read, that's been quite successful and will continue to roll out. And I know in our own business, as we've shifted to a way more flexible way of working over the last 18 months, I'd say we've become significantly more productive. And everybody's happy to get back into an office where they can and have more connectivity, but having flexibility in their lives and more time to do other things, people are clearly happier too. So that it does work.
All right, well, let's talk COP26. Cops and robbers. Who are the cops? Who are the robbers? And what's on store?
Yeah, so I think a great place to start really is, what's the point? Now, what's the real objective of COP26 through the eyes of the organizers and the main actors? And in my eyes, that is, most major countries have committed to net zero by 2050. There's broad recognition that that is essential. What's needed is significant action quickly enough that we have a reasonable chance of getting there, which means a lot of the heavy lifting needs to be done this decade, because so far we've spent 50 years doing very little. And this is what the 2030 targets are all about. The big levers relate to energy generation and transport, which between them are about 70% of the task. And that's where we've seen from countries like the US, the EU, commitment to a date for grid zero, and bringing more people to the place where they commit their countries to eliminating CO2 from the energy network is a really big lever. The other is ending the sale of fossil fuel cars.
Right, which some countries have already signed up for, especially in Europe, and even some car companies, including Volvo and others. Nigel, just for definition, what is grid zero? Does that mean zero grid, no transmission grid, and everything goes Tesla style?
Well, for some people, it will absolutely mean that there is no grid because they've gone off completely. And it may not be the best term, but this is that the power grid that people get their energy from becomes zero emission. And the US is committed to that, I think, by 2035, roughly. I think the EU is on the same path. The UK is talking about a similar pathway. And I know in Australia, it could be done in Australia, I think by 2030, because there's plenty of capacity to build solar energy, plenty of capacity to add wind, plenty of ability to add battery storage. And Australia has a demand curve that's well suited to this, because the peak's in the middle of the day. It's not in it's not in the evening or the early morning.
Fadhel, I read a headline in the past 48 hours. Saudi Arabia going net zero, excluding oil exports. So what's possible? What's possible from a country whose economy is based on energy?
Yeah, and Saudi Arabia is not the only country. We have a large block of countries who really depend almost exclusively on oil and gas extraction and exports. And this is really, thank you for the question. This is really what I wanted to comment on, which is what slowed us down for a long time, I think, is a lack of imagination about changing the economic model that we use, not just in the global north, but specifically for countries that are heavily dependent on oil and gas exports, but also countries who are heavily dependent on those to run their own economies, including countries in the global south. So we can't really think about meeting these targets globally unless we simultaneously, not separately, simultaneously think about changing the economic model. Because for a long time, the fear of transitioning to something else was related to the fear of loss of revenues, loss of jobs, loss of economic independence for countries that heavily depend on massive oil and gas revenues, and a fear of sliding back into the dark ages of underdevelopment and poverty if you take away the biggest chunk of the economy. And what we've been able to accomplish, when you say we collectively in this movement over the last couple of decades, is gradually, unfortunately very slowly, demonstrate that a very successful, thriving, profitable economy can be built on a green foundation. And the Green Jobs Report essentially shows that that is the case. But unfortunately, you find a lot of governments that are still kind of trapped in the old way of thinking and resisting the transition. I think this is going to go away very quickly in the next few years, because the rate of growth of green jobs and the pay across the world is outstripping the fossil fuel industry and the extractive industries. The demands of the public, especially youth, are clearly moving in the right direction. And just technology and economics, common sense, you can't miss it. Green technology is getting much more efficient year after year, and much cheaper and economically efficient, that it will outcompete fossil fuels in every country. It's already outcompeting most extractive fossil fuels in most of the world, but in a matter of years, it's going to outcompete everybody else everywhere.
Yeah.
We have a question. We have a question. Jim Whitman is asking a question. Says small islands, the Aotearoa Council for International Development in the South Pacific has been running an online conference this week. And there was a tweet carrying an opinion from Samoa that their experience was that countries did not necessarily have Samoa's best interests as primary. Not a surprise. Countries like Palau, the Maldives may not exist by the end of this century. So what's going to happen at COP26?
An indigenous nation.
Seriously? Go ahead.
And just to add, an indigenous nation and one of the indigenous tribes in Australia has just brought a legal action because they're one of the first parts of the country to disappear against the government for lack of action to protect them. But Fadhel, this is very much your subject.
Yeah, I mean, small island nations, specifically Pacific nations, are literally on the front lines of climate change. So the framework that the climate change conferences, the COP conferences, have been centered around is loss and damage framework in terms of when there is a climate event, we'll figure out a way to compensate you. I think that if we started with that framework and had actually the funding for it back in the 1970s or 80s, maybe we'll be in a good place. But today, this is way too small of a framework for financing a climate transition and a just transition for small Pacific Island nations and countries that are on the front lines. Even the Green Climate Fund, and right before we started the webinar today, I went to the website to see how much the fund has. This is a fund that was supposed to have $100 billion by last year, by 2 years ago, actually, in order to help finance the transition in the global South in particular. And it finally reached $10 billion probably the last month or so. So we're not even close. So in terms of neglecting the interest of small island countries and developing countries, absolutely. And this neglect has been done not just by the global North, but also by fellow countries in the global South who unfortunately depend very heavily on extractive industries for their own economic activity and job creation, which is why we're not going to accelerate this transition unless we design a new global financial architecture, economic development model that works for everyone, including countries like Nigeria today that depend heavily on fossil fuel exports and can't afford to give it up immediately unless we have an existing economic development model that will create the equivalent amount of jobs, if not more, and will create the level of economic activity that allows it to not only fight climate change and be resilient, but also build a thriving economy that's more secure in terms of its food security, in terms of its energy security. And today we do have the technologies to allow us to do that. The question is the financing.
We had a great discussion on this a couple of weeks ago with Stephanie Kelton, and we'll put a link to that in the chat because it's incredibly important.
So the question is about financing. How do we pay for this transition? And there's different frameworks. I think the loss and damage framework, carbon tax, and cap and trade, all of those are useful, but are very limited in terms of their impact globally. I think the direction in which we need to move is the following. When it comes to climate change, globally, we're either going to sink or float collectively. It's not going to be, some portion of humanity will survive and the other will sink. So we have to think globally, beyond national borders, beyond national interest on this single issue, which means when we design climate mitigation policies and climate finance policies and COP26 and COP27, we have to think beyond the national interest, because our national interest now is interlinked with everybody else's interest when it comes to this. And because of this interlink, we have to think about how do we finance globally, not just bilaterally, not just on an individual basis. And when you think of global finance, there's one number that I'd like everybody to carry with them today, because if we miss this point, we're not going anywhere in terms of climate action. Globally, when you divide rich countries and poor countries and you net out all financial transactions, today we have $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. That includes the Green Climate Fund, that includes charity and interest payments and FDI, all global financial transactions. So that's why I say the global financial architecture is extractive. And we're not going to put a dent in climate change unless we figure out a way, especially for the global South countries, to reverse the flow of $2 trillion in order to accelerate the green transition. And that includes not just financial reversal of these flows, but also technology transfer and technology cooperation and intellectual property rights framework that allows us collectively to accelerate the transition and help developing countries who are currently dependent on fossil fuel exports to build a different economic model that's built on resilience. Otherwise, they will continue to extract and export. And that's why you have countries like Saudi Arabia, like Nigeria, like other OPEC countries who are saying, we're with you on climate change, but don't touch our exports yet.
Yeah, and indeed, Norway has just said exactly the same thing, which it's on a path to ending its fossil fuel industry, but it's not going to slow that quickly because it wants the money to continue to invest in their transition. That's the heart of Australia's national policy, which is we're going to continue using coal for as long as we possibly can. Yeah. And the point you're making was Jane Goodall made the same thing at her observations from the early in her career, thinking about the degradation of nature in Gombe Stream National Park and thinking this is terrible, but unless you find a way to give the local people an economic and economically inclusive solution, why should they change? Because they're just trying to live their lives. Now, I think I'm going to jump to one of the very good questions that's come up from Mark Johnson around why is animal agriculture rarely mentioned in the climate crisis discussion? And because it's not just CO2, it's methane and other gases. And I'm happy to say for Mark, we were about to go there. This is on our list of topics. Very briefly on the way to it, all the big car companies are committed to significant electrification of their fleets by 2030. They cannot undo that very easily. What they can do easily is drop the fossil fuel ranges sooner than they're currently planning. And we're already starting to see some of those changes brought forward. So I think that's an interesting space to watch. The animal agriculture point is incredibly important because it is a really significant component of overall emissions. And it is in some ways much more slippery to deal with because it's an incredibly fragmented industry. You can deal with coal and oil through dealing with maybe 50 companies will account for a very substantial amount of all oil and gas and coal extraction in the world. In agriculture, it's way more complicated because the underlying farming is incredibly fragmented. And so that, to shift that requires whole of industry changes. And, if it's beef we're talking about, technologies are emerging, seaweed-based dietary additives, which can reduce the amount of methane emitted, but that's going to take a long time to have a significant impact. So I think this absolutely should be on the agenda, and it will be really interesting to watch through COP26 which countries really announce anything or come forward with anything to grapple with this. Australia is a significant beef exporter, countries like Brazil. What is going to happen? So I don't know, but it's a great point from Mark. It should be a part of everybody's discussion.
Well, some of it's already happening. Happening. So, we do have large funded companies like Beyond Meat, which is public, and Impossible Foods. We have investments being made by Tyson Foods and other providers. we have McDonald's saying they're going to address their scope 3 emissions in their beef supply chain. I mean, the one major shift is for those cows, for the people who are processing cows, if it's not already being fed by grass versus corn, that is a shift. So there is some technologies to help adapt those methods, those food production methods for that. Then there is the shift towards meatless proteins. So that's happening already, and the younger people are driving some of this. So it is. I mean, not sure why animal agriculture isn't covered as much. It's probably better to shift your diet than to shift your light bulbs. So that is, a higher multiplier effect. But, some of these are ingrained traditions. So you just need exposure to some new recipes in order to say, oh, wow, this is just as good or even better. And so one of those is the riced cauliflower and shredded mushroom bolognese that my wife makes, that I swear nobody could tell the difference if they didn't know it.
I had my first Impossible Burger in San Jose a couple of weeks ago, and it was shockingly good, to be honest, shockingly good. And afterwards, having felt like I'd had a big meaty burger with all the unhealthy fats in it, I then didn't feel like that immediately after I'd finished eating. So the diet part of this is fascinating. And again, there is a lot more money flowing to these companies now than 1 or 2 years ago. It's become a really hot space, but the quantums involved are still tiny. So I think watch this space for countries that are talking about technological change to support these shifts. Most of these technologies actually are already here. Some of them require some refinement. There's plenty of work to do on cell-based fermentation, but this isn't going to take 10 or 15 years of science. It's going to take a few years of science. And
we have
be really good products out there.
ESGX episodes on food, as well as islands that we talked about earlier, as well as other solutions. Fadhel, thoughts on agriculture, especially with regards to...
I completely agree with everything that's been said by Nigel and Paul. What I wanted to add to this discussion is the important role of public health policies and education policies. By education, I literally mean education, as in schools, because this is primarily a problem in the global north, but it's also the case in many developing countries. Excessive consumption of meat and sugar in particular, and all the public health consequences in terms of diabetes and heart disease and other illnesses that are extremely expensive, actually, from a public health perspective, financially, and in terms of quality of life and productivity. So you're not going to successfully tell people stop eating this or reduce your consumption of meat or sugar or burgers or anything and get successful results immediately. You're going to have to start with younger generations, not only through the education about the health effects and better diets, but you also have to build the infrastructure for it outside the school system, meaning media campaigns, meaning building the infrastructure in terms of providing high quality, nutritious foods and recipes and cultural cultural preservation revival of old traditional recipes that are actually healthier than the mass consumption of meat and sugar that we've built over the last century. And that is a huge investment for governments to put into cultural heritage preservation, not in terms of museums and buildings and fashion, but also food culture. And that in and of itself, in addition to technological changes, in addition to raising awareness and reducing waste, all of that will pay off, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's a generational shift. And unfortunately, we haven't started this on a national scale broadly enough to actually pay off on this front. But it absolutely has to be part of the conversation.
And it's going to be really interesting here in New York, because we have elections for the governor of New York taking place currently. The expected candidate wins, which is Eric Adams. He is a vegan. He was on a path to diabetes some years ago, shifted to a plant-based diet, dramatically improved his health. And so in coming to office, he brings an explicit plant-forward agenda as part of that to shift the diet and improve health in New York City. You know, in this case, driven originally from his own personal experience. But things like that can drive iconic change, which I think is can be really impactful. Again, whether we see any of this at COP26 is another matter completely. Now,
so Nigel, you're going to be on the ground at COP26.
So I will be there for part of the time, and we will come to you live from Glasgow on the 9th of November. It will be fascinating to see where we have got to. So we'll be slightly more than halfway through. This will be our COP halftime report, nicknamed Glasgow Ranges. We'll just see exactly what targets are being talked about. And I think we should all prepare for COP26 not necessarily to deliver enough at all, and to walk away knowing that we all have to continue to act anyway. One thing I was going to come to before we end is just to talk a little bit about
let me just add on one
this.
thing, Nigel, because I read something today that said, if you add up all the net zero commitments of the existing corporates, this not only includes science-based targets, which are real, but net zero commitments, many of which have happened this year, we're still headed for a plus 2.2 Celsius world. So not even a 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 Celsius, but a 2.2. And that's just from ambiguous commitments. And then I also want to notate, these COP sessions usually wait till the last day and the last night or the second to last midnight. So you're calling it a halftime report, which is probably true for 9 days of the 12 days in. It may not even be halftime yet by the time.
Look, it may be like Wimbledon and continue into a third week. Who knows?
Sure. So,
and that's maybe a neat segue to the politics, which is, Boris Johnson clearly needs anything that he can announce which looks successful. Whether it actually is successful, I suspect doesn't matter very much to him because his politics is relatively superficial. But I would say for the EU, which has had long-term significant commitment to decarbonisation going back to the introduction of the carbon price some long time ago, and for the US, which is now on a fairly significant path to decarbonize some really significant parts of the economy, and for China, there's plenty to play for here. And I'm fascinated. I don't know if Fadhel or Paul, you've got any particular views on how that might play out.
I'm sorry, the sound broke a little bit. Can you repeat the last part of the question? The three big nations in this game, the EU as a bloc, and then the US and China. I'm interested in, what do you think the politics around that are? What are they trying to achieve? I think, my take on China would be that China is well organized and has got very clear plans in what it's trying to do on many fronts, and it will continue to pursue those. And so it's still building coal-fired power stations. Yeah, but I really don't think that they're going to be used for anything like their normal expected lives. That's another discussion. Yeah, my comments. Yeah, my comments earlier are really about this particular question, which is unfortunately the three leading blocs and these negotiations are still thinking in terms of narrow economic interest, national interest. They're moving in the right direction in terms of commitments within their own countries to decarbonize, but the pace is very slow and it's still individualistic in the sense of individual nations. The commitment to truly doing a global kind of reset for where we're going, it's still marginal. And that's why we see this huge division within these blocks. And when we, the international community, recognize that we need to move beyond national interest and national strategies, and truly think as a single global unit, I think that's going to be the turning point. And I think we can't leave today without answering the question. Cops are robbers. Who's winning? And it's related to your question, Nigel. And I think the cops are not winning yet, but the robbers are definitely on the run. I'm not so sure that we'll have a happy ending to this in COP26, but I truly feel it's within reach. Definitely for COP27, if we keep pushing and working hard enough in this direction, that by the time we go to Cairo and COP27 next year, we will have most of the robbers hopefully on our side. I don't want to continue the metaphor in terms of putting people in prison and all that, but most of them.
Oh, we're just losing Fadhel slightly there.
Yeah, well, this is a good clip to end on.
They'll see the economic momentum.
We've just lost you a bit, Fadhel, there, and I might just jump in.
The narrow national interest of the U.S. and China and the EU.
Yeah, we've just lost you slightly there, but the point is absolutely right, which is we do need those countries to, step up and look at the bigger picture. I think the other thing is we might, who is the policeman in all of this? And ultimately the policeman is us. It is the individuals as we vote, because there's no one else who is going to step up and try to drive this change. Australia is interesting because it has an election coming up within the next 6 months or so. And there are some very strong independent candidates and key constituents who may yet end up winning the balance of power in the lower house, which would be transformational for politics in the country in a way that perhaps both major parties would not like, but it would certainly drive change. And not every country has the same dynamic. I think Paul, do you want to add a comment to this around the politics of it all?
I'll just answer the cops or robbers question. Robbers winning. Cops need to use their weapons, tools, and enforcement of the law, or enhance the law so that the robbers can be on the run, and to show how the robbers can rehabilitate. But right now, the average public company rates on a sustainability scale as extractive, most of all on earth, but also on people and trust. As a sector, business is viewed as the most competent and the most ethical, even versus government and nonprofits. So that's a bonus for business, but they're going to blow it if business doesn't become more sustainable faster. So long-term cops, short-term robbers, let's hope COP26 can shift the scale.
Absolutely. And just to end, there's a great question in here from Francisca Rydecker, who's one of our very regular guests. I know her name is often there asking questions and contributing. What if oil producing countries were thinking of and being held accountable for their Scope 3 emissions? Am I daydreaming? And my comment on that would be, and let's add coal in here as well. It's going to be driven, in my mind, perhaps more by the economics than anything else. The economics, as Fadhel said earlier on, around renewable energy versus coal are massively in favor of renewable energy. If you've just built a new coal mine and you think you're going to be selling that coal for the next 50 years to China, I would be really surprised, because I think the Chinese have got an enormously more sophisticated plan than that. And if they really needed access to coal for 50 years, they'd have bought it, as they have done rare earths for all the solar panels and batteries. China's invested barely $1 in securing supply of coal. Follow the money. Ditto electric vehicles. Do you really want to buy a fossil fuel powered vehicle now, when it wouldn't take much for the big motor companies to say, you know what, instead of running dual fleet strategy for another decade, we're just going to phase the fossil stuff out as it all comes to the end of its lifetime, which will happen in the next 7 years. And that will then drive suddenly there won't be as many gas stations. It'll be like New York City, where there's kind of 2 in the entire island, as far as I know. It's not very convenient.
There are more than 2, but yeah, it's not convenient. All right, Nigel, what's coming up for future ESGXs?
Fantastic. Look, let me just pop these up. We have coming up next week 60 minutes to save the world. And this is all about the journey from advocacy to climate action. What can you do in 60 minutes a week that will make a real difference? And we've got a great group of guests for this. It's going to be lively, it's going to be interactive, and we have one of Australia's more influential and important politicians who will be joining this discussion too. So very much look forward to that one. As we said, the week after that, Glasgow Rangers, the nearly halftime, Are We Done Yet report from Glasgow. And then the week after that, Paul, maybe you want to intro this one.
Yeah, happy to. We have the launch of a new book written by David Jaber, and it's about going climate positive to net zero and beyond, just as Buzz Lightyear would say, and on sustainable energy fuel, of course. And so we'll dig into this issue actually about food and going net positive in food as well as other industries. And you can find the Going Climate Positive book in the ESGX bookstore. So we're really excited to have all of you with us today. Please feel free to like and share this video on YouTube, share this ESGX with your community. And Nigel, I look forward to having you on the ground, maybe with bagpipes at COP26 in Scotland.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Fadhel. As always, it's been a great discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to next week.
Thanks, Amir and Nick. Have a great week.